I'm gonna try to get a head start on Chanuka. See where we can get. It's not. I've actually I've made some slides, and it's not one time or two times or three to get. doesn't We don't finish things that fast. But basically, we'll start from the beginning and see what we can make out of it. You wanted to go to more practical, you say, instructions. We'll see if we can get to that. So I've divided. We're working with the text of Kavanos, although there are other texts, and especially if you look in the Siddur, or if you even in the Rashash in Nar Shalom, has a bunch more information, or actually I won't say more information, but possibly more rimazim, more like different kavanas that are not in Shar Kavanas. Shar Kavanas and Chanukah is very short, relatively, right? Relative to other things. There's also a bunch of other versions of the Arizal, like all over, and especially in places like this where there's like, we could call it, there's a little bit of theory and a lot of practical, like to them, finding a new kavana or a new gematria or a new resheteves, a new thing to be machavan is practice. It's not only, a lot of it is not really theory, it's about the practice of being machavan based on the letters, the otiyot, the words, the value, the gematria of the words, and all of these kind of things. So people that worked with that had a few more, I don't know if a lot more, but there's a few more things that you won't find here. And especially since there's a lot of Hasidic Torah and Chanukah, some of what they quote is not really in Shara Kavanas, it's in other versions of the Rizal, especially in Prietz Chaim. Prietz Chaim does not have a lot more than Shara Kavanas, but there's like 2-3 more things that are quoted a lot and are in Prietz Chaim, and as well as in other sources. There's this whole book. Where's my book? It's on another table, but there's a whole book, Kisveh Rizal and Chanukah, that put together all the different sources that exist, which is pretty well done. And then in general, we always have a certain structure, a certain list of things that Arizal has to understand in each Yom Tov, in each mitzvah, we could say, but especially in each Yom Tov, which Shar Kavanas is based around. It's not really based around mitzvahs, there's Shara mitzvahs that to talk about different mitzvahs, but holidays is one of the things that he's very much interested in, because it's a time to actually work with these things. In a certain sense, the Yom Tovim are in themselves made for getting the practice, getting the actual results of all the theories and all the kavanas, all the amshachas and yichidim and moich and all of these things. If they get practice at a certain point, like the Sfardim Mekabalim say, the halacha lema'asa of Kabbalah is always to be mechavan. That might not be the only thing where halacha lema'asa is, because knowledge is also something to be done, and definitely in the Kabbalistic and the more internal way of thinking. Knowing something is doing something. It's not that knowing something doesn't do anything, but knowing it in the right time, like the pasuk "Dover be'itay ma'toiv," right? Kol pasuk bezmano says "Dover be'itay ma'toiv." Some saying about that, about actually doing it or actually having the thought in the right time is something else for the Machavne, for people that want their thoughts to correspond to what they're doing and to what's going on in the real world. So generally, if it came to Yom Tovim, like the major ones, like so I saw the Sapsahom Achlekes if Chanukah is a minor Yom Tov, but in the major ones, known as the Deraisa ones, like Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, especially, there is a lot to say, a lot of theory to explain the story of the Yom Tov, the history, giving another pshat, giving the pshat al pisod for the history, for the, like Yetzias Mitzrayim, we talk about what is Mitzrayim, what is Paroi, what is Haman, all of these kind of things, as well as according to that interpreting all the mitzvahs, all of the things that we do, all of the tefillahs especially, as a way to, we could say, reenact what happened then in an internal sense. So we discussed this on Purim, or what that's supposed to mean. What happens is at some point, sometimes, especially like a dish like Hanukkah, the way it looks is more like you already know all the stuff. Now I just need to give you some pointers of like connecting things. This is this and that is that, and then you'll figure out most of it by yourself. So there's not a lot of text, and definitely not a lot of theoretical text, not a lot of explaining the story. There's like one in Shar Kavanos, there's nothing to explain the story of Hanukkah, absolutely zero. And Fritz Chaim, there's like a half a line to connect what his theory is to the story. That's the extent of the Arizal's pshat on the story of Hanukkah. Of course, the story of Hanukkah doesn't exist in other sources either too much. So maybe that corresponds to that. Like, right, it's not in the Tanakh, obviously, because it was written after whoever decided that the Tanakh is over, and it's not in the Mishnah or in the Gemara. Really, there's like also like 5 lines in Masechtas Shabbos that like supposedly tell the story, but that's not really the story. I mean, it's only like 5 lines out of a long story, and there's different books that give the story, but we kind of didn't include them in the canonical rabbinical works. Didn't include them either. And Midrash has very little about the story of Hanukkah too. There's some special Midrashim on Hanukkah which are kind of based on those, on what we call apocryphal sources and stuff like that. But so, anyways, there's very little for the theory of it, and therefore very little to connect that to the Kabbalistic way of thinking of how the world is supposed to work and how things would connect with that. There's like one line in Retz Chaim talks about that. So what most of it is kind of like doing like this is this and this is this, and then so we could say more practice than theory. More it's not even practice. It's more like once you kind of know the structure of the world, once you kind of know what you have to do, what the Avodas Hashem is about, you just need to find a way to find that in whatever you're doing. So, for example, if we know that everything is to make a yichud, which let's say is connected to Absag Ma'aben, so all I need to do in anything is just to show you where's Abs, where's Sag, where's Man, where's Ben, and how it works. Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it going sideways? Like 2-3 things, and that brings with it the whole Etz Chaim. It brings with it a whole world. Doesn't mean that it's a small subject. There's no small subjects. There's no small mitzvahs. Mitzvah kalak and chavivas, and all this chavivas of Hanukkah. There's not really any small mitzvahs, but there's mitzvahs that after, if it's also like in the end, at least in the end of in the end of Shar Kavanos, basically, like after the whole long Masechta of what to do for every day, you don't really need to have a whole long Masechta to tell you like every prat again. It's just connecting the strings that connect that to that, and then you already know. So that's a way of doing things. Now, in general, we could say that the Kavanos always are going to be divided in 2 things, and then we can divide them further. Firstly, in every Yom Tov in the world, Shabbos Yom Tov has 2 different aspects. Those are the numbers Aleph and Bez. These are copied from the headers that I made for Shar Kavanos. We'll see. I'll send you the whole document, but I put it all in the slides. The first one is that's actually 2 and 3, right? Number 1 is what Arizal does always, as we've seen many times. The Chaim Vital's order is always to begin with some little practical things, not even practical kavanah things, right? Sometimes there's some kavanas in there actually, but sometimes it's just like based on minhagei Arizal, right? What did Arizal do this? How did he do Chanukah? How did he do different things? And sometimes just based on what his opinion was in halacha, sometimes based on what his minhag was. Not always. Some people assume that it's always based on Kabbalah, which it might be, but he at least doesn't explain it that way always. And not over here also, there's just like one piece about which direction that is all lit the Chanukah left, from right to left or from left to right, whatever the order was. And there's some discussion of this in Hilchos Chanukah, how is the right way, and therefore he wrote down what Arizal did. But that's all. That's like part of the thing of starting with simple, easy halacha things usually. But then when we get into the actual sugya, the actual understanding, we have always two different things. So one is what he calls kedushas hazman. In other words, when we say Mekadesh Yisrael v'Azmanim, right? We say Shabbos Kodesh. So we're saying the time, the day, the week, the time has a certain kedusha, certain elevation in Larizal's language, actually, a certain higher level than the weekday. So this is not talking about, it's not two things. It's not talking about the history. It's not talking about it's not talking about what happened once upon a time. Or we can talk about a story. We're talking about belonging to a history, like a greater story. And it's not talking about the things that we do, right? That's going to be the third thing. That's the second thing here. We talk about mitzvahs. We talk about, for example, Pesach. We could talk about three different things. We could talk about the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim as it was then, as what lesson of it, what the moral of the story is, what the secret of it is, all kinds of devils about that. And we could talk about the halacha, right? Literal halacha. So in other words, there's medrash, which talks about the story. There's halacha, which talks about what we do. Of course, the halacha itself has a premise, has a certain kavanah, we could say, certain yichud or certain explanation in the Arizal system of what that is, what that's going to do. You're going to eat matzah, what it's going to do. You're going to shake your liliv, what is that going to do, and so on. But before that, we have to talk about the Kedushas Hayom, like we were talking about Kedushas Hayom. Kedushas Hayom is a thing in itself. So, for example, we could sometimes, I think, in general, in Shabbos and Yom Tov, it expresses itself in Isser Malacha. So it's day of rest. It's a day of not allowed. There's halacha in that also, but that's not really something that you do. It's not like Shabbos, what we do is we don't do, or something Yom Tov. It's about that this day is holy. There's this time. The time there's a chalois kedusha on the time, on the actual duration of time that day. And in other words, that day, another way of saying it, and if you want to say it in an experiential way, that day feels different or looks different or is different even before you do anything. Like the Moedani of that morning, Moedani is already talking about doing something, but before that is already different than the other days. And then when you do things, then since it's based on that platform, we could say that's what makes everything different, or at least that helps you. And that is actually in other places would define exactly, and here also, but not in the same way we does it usually. He would define exactly which level, like there's levels of Moichen, we discussed different levels of Moichen, Abevim, Yashsot, Zon, so on, different levels of Moichen. And the result in Yom Tovim and Shabbos would define what kind of level of Moichen do you receive just by virtue of it being that day. So just because it's Shabbos, or like we accept, so the Mekabbalim actually like created a ritual of Kabbalah's Shabbos. They didn't do Kabbalah's Yom Tov, interestingly, but there's Kabbalah's Shabbos. There's not really I have to think about why. But there's not Kabbalah's Chanukah either. But there's Kabbalah's Shabbos. And that's just about, it's Shabbos. It's not about we're doing something, we're making a meal, or we're learning something, or we're davening something. It's about, it's Shabbos. And it's Shabbos is different than it's Sunday or it's Monday. And that is what would say that that's a certain level of moichin, that's a certain level of neshama, that's a certain level of mind that happens by itself. It's like it happens on its own. It's not something that you experience by virtue of work, right? This happens by itself. We could call it like estrisa de la if you want. Not exactly correspond to the same concept, but something that's just automatic. And then there's the part that you have to work. So in other words, now that it's a good day, now do something with it. Now that it's a good day, do something with it. And when you do something with it, you have to you would get another level up to that. So in other words, since you started higher, so you can go even higher and do even greater things. And that's the two important things. And Daizal is one of his chiddushim. It seems like it's a chiddush. He seems to, and if you read the text, you'll see him looking for a proof for this, is that Chanuka and Purim and Rosh Chodesh and all these other little minor holidays, they also have Kedushas Hayom. So we could have thought that Hanukkah is just a weekday. You're allowed to do malacha, and it doesn't seem to be a holy day. It might be like a Yom Tiv. There's like, say Halal or whatever it is. There's not really halachic there's of course some ideas in halacha about not doing melacha when we light the Chanukah lech, or maybe some people would have there's like different minhagim about this, but it's not al halacha, not mekra din. But the Arizal said that spiritually speaking, kabbalistically speaking, this is a Yom Kodesh, just like every other Yom Tov. This day, by virtue of it being a day, has to have some kind of level of Kodesh, and he goes on to explain what's the exact level. It's not the same level of Shabbos or Yom Tov, or each Yom Tov has its own, but it's going to have a certain level, and maybe something even different, at least, than all the other ones. And if you like that difference, then you could say that it's better. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, which is over here in Amber Gimel, is the actual mitzvah. Chanukah has one main mitzvah, although we could actually say there's two main mitzvahs, right? So there's halal v'hodah, which seems to have been the important thing. I mean, we say halal, say alanissim. We could say saying sounds like it's the wrong thing, right? We thank halal, we sing halal, or praise by halal, however you want to say it. It's not really about saying. Likraya sahala, lizat sounds wrong, right? Lahalal sahala. Why do we say likraya sahala? Oh, should read halal? That's it, like a reading. I don't know. I think it's a wrong nisach. There's a different nisach that should be the better nisach. But anyways, the halal.
Like a recitation, no?
Yeah, well, that's what it is, because it says everything that's in the siddur is a recitation, but it's like not.
Yeah.
It's not like there's a mitzvah to say halal. Like it's like your mother tells you, say thank you. She doesn't really mean, you should say thank you.
No, meaning like Kriyas the Torah is definitely not reading the Torah. It's really the recitation, no. Reading is silent.
Oh, you mean reading should be meant? Yeah, reading, that's true. Reading is halal doesn't mean reading in the modern sense. It means calling would be close to the like Quran, like recite. It's not really, like public recitation, Yeah, okay, so maybe that makes it better. Yeah, maybe that's the answer. But anyways, that's one of the avodas of Chanukah. Yeah, I think that's true. Makes sense. That's one of the avodas of Chanukah. And that Arizal doesn't really talk. He does talk about that, but not very explicitly. The only way you would see it when he talks about tefillah and what the tefillah of Chanukah different, or the yichud of Chanukah would be different, and apparently we would have to connect that to that. But he doesn't talk about it as actually, the Rashash does seem to have a whole kavanah for Halal of Chanukah, special for Halal of Chanukah. So maybe that's, like I was saying, there's some practice missing in the Shar Kavanos. Actually, it also asks for the Kriyas HaTorah of Chanukah. It connects it with the whole, what we read on Chanukah, with the Purim that the Nesiim brought. He has a whole pshat, what it means, and you should be mechavan on Chanukah. So maybe, so that's part of the extra stuff that we don't have in Shar Kavanos, but give more explanation of different practices. Okay, so we have that. But in any case, the main mitzvah of Chanukah is definitely the Hadlakas Ner Chanukah. And therefore, we have to explain what does it mean, Hadlakas Ner Chanukah. What is that? Well, people would say, what does that symbolize? But the Arizal would not say it symbolized. They didn't have the concept of symbol. He would say, what is it? What is it really? I know what it is in Olam Asiyah. I want to know what it is in Olam Atzilas. So that's the second thing. And then, based on that, connecting with that is, we could say, the way we perform that, and especially the place where we would be mechav. And generally, that Arizal always puts the kavanah of the mitzvah, at least a lot of them, at least a remes to them, in the bracha, like in the tefillas, because his kavanah, it's hard to do. There's different reasons for this. I always think of different reasons why. In other words, we could talk about the Ner Chanukah. In other words, like Haroya Ner Chanukah, right? Ner Chanukah is not, the bracha is just like both of the Rabbanim, but generally, if you have a mitzvah, the mitzvah is the Raisa, the main thing is the actual mitzvah, and then we say a bracha on the mitzvah. Why we say a bracha? So it's like the Chachamim, is to say a bracha mitzvah, is to acknowledge what you're doing, or maybe you can even say that the bracha is generally made to create a kavanah, right? It's like saying the kavanah. That's really what brachas are usually like. Baruch Hashem, shekideshanu lechel matzah, whatever. Allah chilas matzah, we don't say lechel matzah. That's like creating a verbal space for the mitzvah, or you could say putting kavanah around it, or declaring, making it more declarative, make it more explicit what you're doing. So that's the bracha of a mitzvah. And Chanukah, and seemingly because it's like that, well, you have to always understand too. And of course, if you would ask the Arizal technically, he would tell you always that a bracha is this bechina, and the actual mas is another bechina, tzaddik lam and mem, and so on. But these are That's true, but generally there's going to be another whole thing. Like you could see it by all mitzvahs, but by the bracha he would try to put it into the language, into the text of the bracha, like lahadlik ner Chanukah. How do you read lahadlik ner Chanukah al pi Kavanos Arizal? And that would somehow connect to, we could say bimaramas, or include whatever Chanukah is, whatever ner Chanukah is. So just like by the bracha al pi pshat, by the words of the bracha, by the vocalization of the bracha, you'll have creating a kavanah. By doing that, you would have the thought probably in that time, because that's when the Kabbalah are usually mechavan the kavanah of the things, when they say the bracha for the thing. Some people would add, then later Mekabolim came and it said, well, the bracha is not long enough, so they added l'shem yichud, which is just extended bracha, really. If you think about the idea of a bracha, it's like instead of just saying a bracha, I would say tell you the whole story of it, and because bracha is not enough. Okay, that's like another level of the same thing. But anyway, so therefore we have a whole elaboration of what to think of in this word of the bracha, and how do you mechavan the shem of the bracha, mechavan the words of the bracha, and so on, and they're all going to be connected with the actual understanding, right? We discussed this also by, for example, we're learning in Birchas HaShachar, right? The same thing. You have Netilas Yadayim and have Birchas Netilas Yadayim, and they're somehow have to be corresponded. They have to have the same idea, because the bracha is on what you're doing, but it's two different things. We can talk about what the action does, and talk about it on a bodily level, on a actual level, of the physical level, material level, and we could talk about on the verbal level of what you're saying, and how, which is the level where most Torah happens at the verbal level, at the level of letters, at the level of words, where what you talk about. You talk about the psukim. Let's say, obviously in Chanukah there's not really any text, any real text, any psukim, but there's the bracha of the Chanukah, and that's where most verbalization, most words are going to be always about the words. That's just how words work. That's all. And then we have Ashai and Vav are more new ways of thinking of these previous things, basically. I just put them there so we can have some kind of structure and what's going on. What we'll see when we get into the actual thing, what exactly that means. But that's my organization. Okay. So I'm going to read just what it says about the minhag. I don't have anything to say about it, just because we like the text, so we have to read the whole thing. Seder Adlakas Anaris. I saw that there's Ruchmayr had a whole chattel about why and stuff, but it's just Seder Adlakas Anaris. Hanoi Knis Chakosef Bes Yosef Alator V'Gam Sefer Shechanarich. So he did what the Shechanarich says, which is right? So the idea is you will light on the left side of the door, right? This gets into the whole controversy of what to do, but whatever. That was at least the meaning of the Arizal and most Chassidim, to light at the door inside, right? They don't do like the Litvish way nowadays to do outside, the Israeli way. They would light inside at the door. I think at the main door of the house, not like some people just find the door. But that was the idea of minhag, but that's another whole machlaikas. Anyways, but the way it works, so it's on the left side. That's the halacha. So it's on the left side, so it means you have like a menorah. So this whole halacha is assuming there's such a thing as a menorah, which is interesting, because a menorah is not a halacha. I guess there's no halacha that you have to buy a menorah for Chanukah. Just a halacha that you have to light candles or oil, whatever, lecht. There's no hilchas menorah, but this whole halacha is assuming there is a menorah, and you have like eight spaces, eight places where to put it, and then you start ending up with a question. Okay, so which side should I light? Like since I put my menorah, so the left side, the most left placed candlestick side is is closest to the door. So maybe I should start closest to the door because I'm trying to put it close to the door. On the other hand, you want to start from the right side. That's usually we have like an idea of starting with the right side always. Although you could say maybe Chanukah should have an opposite idea, because the whole idea of Chanukah is to put it on the left side. So maybe we should start on the left side. Anyways, the Shechanorich's minhag, the Arizal's minhag was to start on the right side. And then so we continue going towards the door, which is interesting. In other words, and the run of the reasonings for that is that we keep on going to the right. In other words, instead of there's a whole machlokes, how do we be mekayim this idea of putting the right before the left. So you could do it two ways. You could, this is actually relevant also to what we're going to learn, and we were supposed to learn about tying your shoes, the right and the left. That is a whole thought about this. Maybe it's connected. Right, you could start from the right, or you could go towards the right, which actually means starting from the left. Right? So what happens with is, on the first day he starts with the right, with the most menorah stick. How do you call it? Branch, rightmost branch. And then the second night we go left of that, but then we so we keep on going towards the right somehow each night. From the second night, we keep on going. We're aiming towards the right. That's like another. Maybe that's a pshat. Aiming toward there's being right and there's aiming towards being right. You know, it's another another way of being right. Maybe it's better. מדליק הנר שבצד שמאלה שהנר היסר קודם וסמך לפסח עם מסחל בוי ונפנו לצד ימין קודם קודם ונמצא הנר הראשון מכלם שבצד ימין המדליק נדליק אחרן בלילה לאחרן. So when at the end of it the rightmost branch is going to be the last because you finally arrived at the right. That's anyways, that's studies of meaning, and that's how I think that's how we do it usually. But that can so much for minhagim. Now we're going to the actual thing. Okay. فأمنا نبعت خلا إنيان كدشة سيام مائلة. We'll explain the kedusha of the days, in other words, of the time. That's what we discussed. After I discuss what the time of Chanukah is, I'll explain the concept of the lighting, the bracha and the lighting of the Chanukah lights. Hina, commission is bash b'shabus v'yam toivim v'yesh chodesh. The Sefes Kedusha al Yimei Achol. So we would learn in Kavanos of Shabbos, of Yom Tov, of everything else, that they have special different levels of what he calls the Sefes Kedusha. Now the Sefes Kedusha generally, we have to think in the Arizal's language about three different things, just at least three different things. I didn't look all of this up exactly, but in general, there's three different things that we could think about when we talk about levels. What does it mean, levels of Kedusha? What does this mean? In the Arizal system, it has to mean something. There's a precise definition for these kind of things. So let's finish what he says first now. So just like we'd learned that Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, which are all the Raisa the Yom Tov, right? The real Yom Tov, in some sense, have the Sefes Kedusha Yimei Achol. Same thing, Chanukah and Purim, although they're just Rabbanim, they're basically like a minhag, basically the people are doing it. There's also the day, also got it, the Sefes Kedusha more than Yimei Achol. But of course, it's not going to be the same level, the same idea as Shabbos and Yom Tov. So if you have read Kavanos of Shabbos and Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh, you should have known all of them. Now we basically have to remember three different things, which are all correlated in some way, but we have to remember three different things about Shabbos and Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh and all of these things. And the three different ways of that is understanding Kedushas Hazmanim, as far as I understand, are one, maybe the most simple one to think about in the Arizal system is called level of Moichin, right? So generally we learn that Imaz Achol are Moichin the Bina or Nai the Bina, Nai the Yashsot. Shabbos, at least at the end of Shabbos, we're going to get up to Atik, to Dikna of Atik, Vak of the Dikna at least. We'll ask other people entirely until we're, but that's Mincha of Shabbos, or generally Mist of Shabbos. The Yichud of Shabbos would be called Avavim Meiloin. That's why it's called Kodesh. So Shabbos is a level of Chachma generally. Yom Tov is generally level of Bina, though of course, they have Yom Tovim that are different. If we learn about Pesach, Barichas, that Pesach night is basically like Shabbos, but then we go back to Bina. And it's a certain level of Bina. There's different things that the Arizal talks about regarding Yom Tov, different from Shabbos. But that's one way of defining the different levels of what he calls Tesefes Kedusha, so Tesefes Moichin. The whole idea of the universe is to have higher Moichin. By default, in Yom Chol we have only Moichin of Vak, or maybe Moichin of Bina. And lower level, Shabbos, we have basically the highest level, technically. Yom Tovim, something in between generally, and there's different Yom Tovim, which each with his own thing. That's one way. This is like a vertical level, right? There's vertical levels. There's Chol, Shabbos, and Chodesh has its own level. Maybe the Rashash would say Keser of Nai, the Ashsot, some level that's Chodesh, and so on. And then, according to that, we would have to think Chanuka. What kind of level of Moichin is there Chanuka? The Rizal doesn't really answer that question, at least not in these Drishim, not in an official way, not in a clear way. So we never know the answer. We have to think about what the answer to that is exactly. He talks about Moichin and stuff like that, but he doesn't really finish his discussion of which level of Moichin is this relative to Shabbos and Yom Tov and all that. The second thing that the Rizal talks about on Shabbos, on Rosh Hashanah, on other times, Yom Tovim, is something called Aliyas Holiness, which of course corresponds somehow to the Moichin, and we have to ask the Rashash and other people to figure out exactly how. But it's another concept, and we kind of understand what these concepts are, right? So Moichin is levels of consciousness, levels of mind. Aliyas Holiness is more closely related to fixing what's broken. In other words, the world is a fallen world. We talk about Shviras Akain, but more generally we talk about B'Yemos Achol, the Shechina, and actually there's also go down in Holiness Abriya, and the Rizal has a whole calculation of how many levels the Holiness go down. Then on Shabbos we have something called Aliyas Holiness, and we have Mincha Ve'er Shabbos and Kabbalat Shabbos, how all the Holiness go back up, 14 levels. So that the Rizal talks about Chem Shabbos. Chem Shabbos is a certain limit. In other words, there's some space between the level of Shabbos and Yom Echol. So this is like not only achieving higher Moichin in like a vertical elevation, it's also about flying up, literally, right? And the Rizal has a whole way of saying whereas like if we would have been able to see it, in other words, if this would have happened also in Chetzonius, you would have literally seen on Shabbos the world flying up. But the reason it doesn't is because it doesn't really happen in the Olam HaChetzonius until Mashiach comes, so we don't really see it. But at this point, this is called Aliyas HaOlam. This is the worlds, the levels that exist here, going up, kind of making empty space under, or like basically bringing up what is here, elevating it to a higher level. And Narizal talks about that's why we have Isra Melacha on Shabbos, because we don't go down, we don't do Beririm, we don't work in the lower level. We're living in the higher plane. So we could talk about this as raising the floor, right? Moichin are like raising the ceiling, or maybe bringing mamshich, something from above lower down, which is just two ways of saying the same thing. But this is about raising the floor. Right? You want to stand in a higher place. And mostly the Isra Melacha of Shabbos is related to this. The Rashash spoke about this in we learned Pesach, although there's a very high Moichin, since there isn't this, so there isn't Isra Melacha like Shabbos, and so on. Now there's a third thing, which is the thing that the Rizal talks about here, and then I reminded myself that there's a fourth thing. So we'll have four different things. There's a third thing, which is called what kind of yichud do we have, or what are the relations between the Za and the Nuk, or the Asvov and the Ashai of the Shem? What are the relations between those entities, and what kind of relation do they have, and what kind of level do they have? Now, of course, this is usually very closely related to the level of Moichin. We talk about there's only a yichud on Shabbos, correctly, a real yichud, because that's called Moichin Bechaya and Moichin Bechachma. That's when we have a yichud. Maybe there's some kind of yichud in Masechol called Yaakov Erechel, different levels of yichudim, Yisrael V'leh, all kinds of different levels of different relations. And we also know what this means, right? We basically understand what this means. The yichud of Zon is what we actually do, or what we're actually accomplishing, and what actually gets accomplished is going to depend. There's a lot of ways of doing it. We can talk about, and like we're gonna talk, this is actually the thing that the Rizal talks about mostly on Chanukah, and from this we're gonna have to extrapolate the rest of the things if we want to. And it makes sense to talk about this mostly because this is actually the form. This is the place where we see it. This is like the maskana. This is like the end result of all of these other things is kind of this. And this is, at least that's the way that Rizal usually says it. Therefore, the kol masha, that's the language that it says later. Kol masha nachni tzrichim lesaken as yichud zon. That's the language of Rizal. Of course, that means to bring moichan, and that means to do beririm and alis oilem. That in order to do that, we have to do all of those things. But what we're actually doing is this, and we could look at what we're doing, what gets accomplished, and see that there's different ways of it getting accomplished. Sometimes it gets accomplished better. Sometimes it gets accomplished worse. Sometimes it gets accomplished sideways, upside down, where it is and which level it is, all kinds of different ways. And that's what's called the level of yichud, or what kind of yichud the zone have, or which zone, we could say even which zone have a yichud, and things like that. That would be another way of defining different days or different levels. That's the third way. A fourth way or a fifth way, I'm going to have two more now. A fourth way of defining it would be talking about kamas, about quantity. Because in other words, everything until now, this is my kind of definitions. Everything, all these three things we're talking about are some kind of quality, or we could talk about them as levels. Of, you could think of it as space, which level you are, higher, lower, different things like that. But we're also talking about the quantity of art. How many things are actually happening, or how big of a thing is actually happening. In other words, there's different ways of maybe conceptualizing this. We talk about the difference between a small person and a big person, or the difference between a klal and a prat, maybe in a different sense, right? In a particular person, a very pratistic kind of person, a different pratistic kind of level, kind of day, just like we could think about people, we could think of days. Everything he does, even his biggest Shabbos, or his biggest Yom Kippur, his biggest Pesach, his Shvius, whatever the highest level is the highest level of some little tiny pitsy world. Some pitsy, how much light could he get? Like 2 ounces. How much revius? Like kleiner kazayas, like sheer, small sheer. That's how much Or is going to get, how much understanding he's going to get, how much connection he's going to get. It's just on a small scale. Then there's something called a greater scale, a greater person. For example, what we call a great person usually doesn't necessarily mean a person that's on a higher level. Like there's a gadol machaveri, it's a gadol mani. You might be making bigger problems, you might be doing greater catastrophes. But if you're in a leadership position, or if you're just a person that's smarter, that has more, in any way, we could call it less particular. You're less about yourself, but it's only one way of saying it. Maybe yourself is bigger. Whatever you're going to do is going to have greater implications. It's going to be involving more. If you understand something, you understand a much greater thing. If you break something, you break a much greater thing. It goes both ways. And in the same sense, and this is the language of Reb Chaim Vital in a previous Trish, actually I'm thinking of that Islam himself, where he said the difference between Shabbos and a weekday is like the difference between a sink that lies, well, he didn't have a sink, but like a Mayan that has like drip, and and like a mabel. That's literally his language. The difference between that and that is different to Shabbos and Yom Tov. In other words, maybe it's in the same level. You know what? Maybe it's in the same level. That's at least what I'm thinking now. Maybe it's in the same level, but there's just the quantity is so different that we could call it a different level. It's entirely, in other words, we're working with really bigger things, with bigger chunks of reality at a time, with much bigger chunks. And Pesach is about, we could talk about being like a general day, right? A klilistic day, which includes some of the whole year. Like Rosh Hashanah, we talk about that being the head of the year, right? So Rosh Hashanah is not a private day. It's not about itself. It's about the rest of the year. And the same way, any Yom Tov, any day that we call a Yom Kodesh has something in it where it's not only about itself. Like Shabbos is about the whole week, or like each Yom Tov is about the whole year in its way. So that would be another way of defining the difference between Yom Tov and a weekday. It's just that it's working with a lot bigger things. It's working with a lot more. And you do one thing, you're doing it in a much bigger scale. It's just in a totally different scale. And of course, this would also be defined, but that is exactly what that means. In other words, which level is this? Maybe that itself would be meaning bina. We could say different words, different addresses for this kind of thing, but that's a fourth kind of thing. And we could talk, maybe we could differentiate in that kind of thing. Like, so maybe Shabbos is a huge marble of light, and Yom Tov is a slightly smaller one, and Chanukah is slightly smaller, and things like that. The Rashash's language for that, at least according to some understandings of it, is where he talks about parts of Yomim and parts of Azmanim, and the Rashash understood the whole universe to be divided in two different ways, and the whole Atzilus to be divided in two ways. One is the way, the daily way, we could call it, the daily way, where it has its own cycle, its own world, its own cycle. Sunday is not part of Shabbos and is in that way of thinking. It's just its own cycle and its own seder shtalshlis, its own whole story. It's generally parts of Chagat, but the whole pshat. Then there's another part of which he calls parts of Hazmanim, in which things happen in a totally different scale and totally different order. They have their own rules, and every Yom Tov, including Chanuka and Purim, right? That's the important thing. Belong to that part. They're working with general things. They're working with greater things. So that's fourth. We're up to number 4. That's the fourth difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov and Yom HaSachar. Fifth difference, which is maybe the explanation of this, or actually the fifth one, usually gets connected to all of these other things in some way. So remember the fifth one. The fifth one is what the Zohar would say many times, and this is something that everyone knows also. Even people that don't learn Kavanos know this, is that we have 10 Sfiras or 7 Sfiras, and we kind of match them to different Yom Tovim, right? So there's the Zohar kind of thought about 7 Yom Tovim in the year, and they each going to match to a certain Sfira, right? So, for example, the 3 Shalosh Golim are very easy. You have Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, which are Chagat. Then you have a bunch of other holidays that we have to fit into this structure, and everyone has their own pshat. But generally, we could think of what people generally think of, and what the Arizal seems to go with, and it says also in Tikkun Azar, is that Chanukah and Purim would be the next 2 Sfiras, which are Netzach and Hod. And then Yesod, we have to find the Yom Tov for, so maybe Chamashasa B'Shvat, that's one thing that Arizal says one time. Or maybe Sukkot is Yesod, that's another thing. Or maybe the Shana is Yesod, says Nizar once. And so on. And then Malchus we have to find for the other things. So we could maybe find 10 Yom Tovim and add in the God also if you want. But the point of this is that this is we have to understand this in a basic sense. What does this actually mean? So just matching things, just mapping things to different. We have 7 Sfiras and 7 Yom Tovim. That's not very helpful. And the Arizal talks about this. What this actually would mean. In any case, one of the things that he says it means. So there's 2 ways we can understand this. One is that we could just put this as a pshat in what we call in the Rashash Seder Azman, what we talked about, that Yom Tovim are working with much greater chunks of reality. Now we could say, so in general, so in other words, if you have 2 parts of reality, like there's the detailed part, daily day-to-day work, daily work, and then there's world historical work, which is what Yom Tovim are about. And it makes sense because Yom Tovim are generally about, at least their story is always about historical stories, right? At least almost all of them. I don't know about Rosh Hashanah. But all of them are about, world. People say you're living in historical times. All times are historical, right? But some of them are interesting to history. And that the ones that have Yom Tovim. So that would be the difference between a regular day and a historical day. This day we live in history. And now, so that's just a binary. That's just, there's 2 categories there. Now, if you want to go and delve into which part of the history is this Yom Tov about? So for that, we could just say Pesach is about the Chesed of the universe, of the history, and Sukkot is about the Gvira, and Shavuos is about the Feres, and Chanukah about the Hod, and Purim about the Netzach, or the opposite, however you want to divide them up, and you'll understand that this Netzach, in other words, this Netzach is not the same Netzach. That's the important thing, right? When we say Chanukah is Hod, that's what usually people say, although the Arizal says sometimes the opposite. Or Chanukah and Purim Netzach v'Hod. That might be more accurate. And when people would say, well, there's also Netzach v'Hod in every day when you put on tefillin somewhere. Why is this one interesting? This one is interesting because this is referring to the Yom Tov one. It's not referring to the two. Just connect. We didn't just connect another set of 7 to the 7. That's too easy. What we did is we're trying to say that this is the biggest point that we could think about or that we could grasp at one time is the one we talk about on Chanuka. So in other words, really there's two dinim here, right? What makes Chanuka different than a weekday is that it is a Yom Tov. Now, which Yom Tov is it? Which part of Yom Tov is it? It's the part of Hod. Or for Pesach, the part of Chesed, and so on. So that's one easy way to understand this fifth thing. And it's like a detail in the fourth thing in a certain sense, or maybe in all of the other things. Now, there's another way of saying it is what the Rizal says other times is more of connecting it to the first two, three things. In other words, the Rizal would, and this is the Rizal's language, so I'm going to have to say it because his language over here is going to be based on that kind of language, where he says, when you have a Yichud, for example, the Yichud of Zon, the Zon could be standing in different locations. In other words, he says on Chanukah, let's not start with Chanukah, on Sukkot, on Rosh Hashanah, the Zon, which is what we're talking about, they're all going to be hanging out in the Tzad Gvura of the world. And on Pesach, they're hanging out on the Tzad Chesed. And on the general days, they're hanging out the Netzach v'Hod. And on Chanukah, they're hanging out both in Hod. That's what he says generally. In other words, if the map of this, the image of this is, as far as I can tell, is that there's like a zon, the Zav and Nuk, which are like small, and they could be in different locations somehow. He never really explains what that means. So therefore, some people say it just means the previous thing. But this is what he says. They could be in different locations, like it's an elevator. Like, the elevator could stop in different floors, and the people in the elevator can be in different places. And on Chanukah, they're riding. That's literally what he says. On Sukkot, they all ride the Gvura elevator. In other words, if we talk about Aliyas Oilemes, or they doesn't want to go up to Kesser, they want to go as high as possible. There's different elevators to go up with. There's a Gvura one. That's why on Rosh Hashanah, wherever we're going to be, we're going to work with the Gvura because we're riding that elevator. Or on Pesach, we're going to ride the Chesed elevator. And on weekdays, we're going to be basically in Netzach and Hod. And Chanukah and Purim are going to stay on that floor. Or we could talk about the elevator, right? So the elevator has different levels. It has different right to left. It has horizontal levels and so on. So that's a fifth way. And I'm up to a seventh point of how to understand differences between different Yom Tovim on different days. And according to this, is what he explains the Kedushas Hayoim of Chanukah. In other words, we're talking about what general kind of thing is Chanukah. And the general thing he says is like what I just said. In other words, if we understand that, I'm going to finish with this. If we understand that on Pesach, everything is Chesed, everything turns into Chesed, we ride the Chesed elevator. On Sukkot, we ride the Gvura elevator. On Shavuos, we ride the Teferes elevator. And the Yichud is Bit Teferes, we could say. That's weird going to happen. On weekdays, generally, we don't achieve high enough like Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. We're only in Netzach v'Hod. And generally, the Rizal says something like this. Generally, on the weekdays, the Zah stands by Netzach. Which Netzach is a good question, but the general Netzach. And the Nuk stands in Hod. And that's how they have their Yichud. So that's as high as they get. So Netzach and Hod, and that's each one is on the right side, and on the left side, and they have a Yichud. On Chanukah and Purim, apparently also, both of them stand on the Hod. That's what he says. And that's why it's special. It's better than any other time. And in other words, it's still a level of a weekday. In other words, if we think horizontally, if we think vertically, Chanukah, that's why we it's a weekday Chanukah. It's still minor. But if we think horizontally, we'll see that there's some difference. And he goes up to define what's the difference. So it seems like it would be just a lower level. And the difference is that since they're both in Hod, another way that means, and we have to explain this, but next time, that means that the Nuk receives the Chelek HaHod by herself, and she doesn't need to get it through the Zah, and that's why we could say that she has her independent or a certain thing that she doesn't have in a general time, and that's the Tesefes Kedusha of Chanukah, and we could talk maybe that's the Ness of Chanukah and so on. I'm going to stop here because that's going to get us into the next thing.